All right, some of you have asked me to do more videos on multimeters, and I'm using mine today, and so I thought I would show what I'm doing and why I'm doing it and how I'm doing it. It's a little bit different than anything I've shown before. In this case, I'm measuring amperage. So if you're unfamiliar with electricity and multimeters, I'll just give a quick explanation. So when you measure amps, it's kind of like measuring the amount of water that passes through a section of the garden hose every minute. Whereas when you're measuring voltage, you're measuring how much pressure is at the garden hose. And so when you hook up your meter to read amps, you actually have to connect it in line, which I'll show you in a moment. But you'll, depending on your meter, you'll have in your dial, in this case, volts, millivolts, ohms, diodes, and then I have these two measurements over here for amps. And when you hook up to amps, you have to change the position of the lead, either amps or milliamps. And on some meters, if you have this hooked up wrong, it'll actually beep at you and say leads. And so that's the first thing. There's a fuse inside the meter that's used when you're doing amps or milliamps. You can actually see that down here at the bottom. It says fused. So that's a little hint for you. And your fuse may be blown. I've blown mine a couple times. I also loaned it out once and someone misused it and they blew it. So anyway, so then when you take an amperage reading, you have to be in line, which means you have to break the circuit. Okay, so I have disconnected the negative battery post, and I have my negative lead from my meter on the negative battery post and my positive lead on the lead that runs. Now, you couldn't start the car through this configuration because these wires are far too tiny, but the circuit is complete. The car is hooked up to the battery via these leads. Now, if you switch these, you just get a negative amperage reading, so that doesn't really matter. You just ignore the negative. And the reason I'm doing this is because this vehicle drains the battery over the course of a day or so, what we call a parasitic draw. And so basically something is staying on in the vehicle, and I don't know what. It's not obvious like a light bulb, and it drains the battery. Now, a critical piece of information when you're doing this is you need to know how much amperage draw is normal. So as an example, you have a clock inside your car and the radio stays alive. Otherwise, you need the new radio code. So a small amount of amperage draw is normal. And what I will tell you from my experience and from working at Volkswagen for 17 years is something like 40 milliamps is normal. We used to say that, the Jetta and the Golf and the Beetle ran about 35 milliamps, and the Phaeton and the Touareg ran around 50 because they had a bit more going on. So for a car like this, which is not sophisticated at all, 1996 Isuzu Trooper, I would expect something very low, like 30 milliamps. So what we actually have is 300 or 0.3 amps. And so now the question is, what's staying on, and how can I determine what's staying on? And generally, the best way to do this, although it's not the only way, it's the way I'm going to show today, is by taking a pair of pliers and removing the fuses one by one. So you remove a fuse and you see if your amperage goes away. And then you take a look at what that fuse is doing, what it's running. And then from there, I can't give you too much guidance because it's going to be different in every case. But if it's related to, like, let's say the glove box, well, then maybe the glove box light is staying on. Or if it's related to, a particular module, like the clock module, maybe somehow the LED illumination for the clock module is staying on. So at that point, it's going to become sort of a single case that I can't really give too much advice on. But that's the process that you use for isolation. Now, if you were to remove all of these and you were to still have an amperage draw, you'd have to consider the other place where you have fuses. Almost all cars have a fuse panel in the engine compartment and a fuse panel inside the car. And out here, you'll normally have your fuel pump fuse, and you'll have big beefy fuses, which are for your radiator fans, things like that. You'll have some relays. So I would start in the interior of the car, pluck them one by one, and then move here to the engine compartment. Now, one other thing to consider is you may pull a fuse and it not change the 300 milliamps, but then when you plug it back in, it goes up to, let's say, an amp. And what that can be, actually, you know what? I'll show you that. Sort of. I'll show you that. So I'm going to basically disconnect the car from the battery, and then I'm going to reconnect it. And you'll see that I'm at 1 amp. And eventually that's going to drop down to 300 milliamps. And what's happening is when the vehicle first gets power, it sort of wakes up and says, oh, I got power. Okay, who am I? What am I going to do today? How's everybody doing? Are all my sensors checking in? And in this case, in a more simple way, when the vehicle first gets power, it turns on the light. So I had already turned off that light, but when you disconnect power and then you reconnect it, it sort of defaults by turning on the light. And the same thing can happen when you're pulling fuses. Probably not on this car because this is a very old car, but on a newer, more sophisticated car, if you were to pull the fuse, as an example, to the engine control module, and then you were to plug it back in, that engine control module is basically being woken up for the first time. And so he's going to wake up, he's going to do some tasks, he's going to check on his sensors. And so what can happen is sometimes you have to wait as you're doing this, because when you plug back in a fuse, you actually wake back up the system and you have to wait for it to go back to sleep. So all right, I hope that helps somebody who's learning how to use a multimeter and track down a parasitic draw in a car. The main thing when you're doing amperage is that you have to open the circuit and insert your meter inside the circuit. So your meter becomes part of the circuit. Whereas when you're taking a voltage reading, you leave the circuit intact and you probe in parallel. So I hope that helps. If not, give it a thumbs down, let me know. But leave a comment below if there's something else you'd like to learn about the multimeter, specifically a particular task or a specific function, and I'll try and do a video on that. All right, folks, take care.